When I started doing YouTube videos, I called my channel Sega Lord X because I knew it would describe the vast majority of the content I had planned to cover. As a dedicated Sega fan, their systems were the focus of most of my gaming time in my younger years. But that didn't mean I didn't buy and play other consoles and their games. During all the hoopla over the Saturn's early launch in North America, Sony was getting ready to launch its brand new PlayStation to a ravenous consumer market excited for a new player. I will confess at first I had very little interest in the device. I had seen big electronics companies come and go in video gaming before. Panasonic and Philips had made little more than a whimper, and honestly, I just didn't see the PlayStation giving Sega or Nintendo any real competition. But as that September launch grew closer, it became pretty clear that Sony's ambitions were quite a bit further along than any company before it. They looked at the market and how games were made, and very intentionally sought to change it all. The hype grew, and when September 9th rolled around, Sony was all anyone could talk about. When all the games and systems disappeared within hours at my local Toys R Us, I knew things were about to change in a pretty big way. Sony didn't intend to compete with Nintendo and Sega at all. Sony intended to rule the market with an iron fist and leave the scraps for the rest of them to fight over. In this episode, we are going to go over the games that were available at the North American launch and its larger 1995 release schedule, talk a little bit about their quality and my mindset at the time as I played them. We start our list with the Crystal Dynamics port of the 3DO classic Total Eclipse Turbo, an on-rail shooter that was very fast and very difficult. That doesn't change here on the PlayStation, and among the launch list, it's easily one of the PlayStation's weakest titles. This was a novelty on the 3DO because we didn't see many games like this back then, but with Saturn out and Sega raising the bar with Panzer Dragoon, all of a sudden this was a lot less impressive. Even the 3DO itself had moved past games like this and started giving owners stuff like Wing Commander 3. It's still not a bad looking or running experience, it just doesn't have a lot of personality or reasons for you to keep coming back for more. An interesting footnote about this one is it came out quite a bit before the console was actually available. It was weird as hell seeing a lone PlayStation game on the shelf to buy with no hardware to play it on. I have some nostalgia for it on the 3DO, but there were many other things I'd rather play on the PlayStation. Power Serve 3D Tennis was developed by a company called SPS and published by Ocean. It was a 3D polygon tennis game with woefully inaccurate physics and camera angles that felt wrong. Take a look at what is going on here. It's like the ball isn't even making contact with the racket, almost as if some invisible force takes a hold of it and shoots it back and forth. At the time, the characters didn't look too bad, kinda like what tennis would have looked like with Sega's Virtua Fighter characters. The flat backgrounds look out of place and the action isn't backed up by a license, so the entire thing feels generic and hollow. It does have a multiplayer mode that helps, and fully 3D sports games weren't exactly standard issue at the time, so it did have a sort of early wow factor going for it. Can't say I'd play it much today though.
$15 all.
NBA Jam Tournament Edition shows up courtesy of Acclaim, and let's be real, this game is going to be fun no matter what it's on. The core design of 2-on-2 basketball with real teams and players that can score massive dunks on one another never gets old. Up until this point, the 16-bit releases were cut back quite a bit from the arcade original, but the PlayStation port manages to cover most things well enough to look and play faithfully. I can still play this one without a care in the world because it's so easy to control and come to terms with its mechanics. So much so, it's something that younger kids can play without much direction. There was a reason the arcade version was such a hit, and the home versions were just as playable.
Basil Dazzle! Robinson! Kaboom!
In those early days of 32-bit releases, Rayman was positioned as the de facto poster child of what next-generation two-dimensional games were supposed to look like. Released by Ubisoft, its ultra-colorful backgrounds, smooth as silk animations, and CD-quality soundtrack really set the stage for a game ready to appeal to the masses. It had everything to draw you in like the Mario and Sonic titles, with a brand new coat of paint that set it apart as something special. And by my guess, it lured hundreds of thousands of gamers to their ever-loving doom. Rayman is indeed a triumph of game design. It ticks all the boxes you need for a good platformer: stuff to collect, fun boss fights, and of course the personality and art design to bring it all together. But what it also has was an absolutely evil difficulty curve that goes off the deep end after the first few levels. This goes from peaceful jaunts in a beautiful forest to hellish screams of your countless deaths. No joke, man, Rayman is one of the hardest platformers I have ever tried to beat. The rate of failure needed to learn its razor-thin timings will break all but the most diehard enthusiasts. Pick it up for the presentation, but if you plan on seeing the ending, prepare for a serious amount of counseling afterwards. A surprise addition to the launch of the PlayStation was the Rayman project, a combo pack of the first two games in that series. The first one had been ported to numerous consoles over the years, but part 2 here was a special edition that had never appeared on a console before. The PlayStation did a very good job with the material. It adds remixed music and has a horizontal mode for a proper aspect ratio. It was actually pretty exciting to see this because along with Rayman, the PlayStation was looking like a 2D monster that could hold its own. Ridge Racer was a port of the Namco System 22 arcade original. It garnered all sorts of praise from the media thanks to its smooth frame rate and overall faithfulness to the arcade original. A lot was made about its extremely short development cycle as well. Namco got this up and running in a mere 6 months, a testament to the fact that the PlayStation hardware could get some fantastic results even with first generation software. And I have to admit, it was an impressive product visually. It wasn't arcade perfect, but you have to admire how close it was, considering the coin-op was essentially cutting-edge hardware itself. It was often cited as an example that Sony's machine was ready to bring home games the Sega Saturn simply couldn't handle. It was hard to argue with the results on the surface. It had better textures, it ran smoother, and the models looked better. Of course, the Saturn's Daytona USA port had to contend with a lot more on screen than Ridge Racer ever did. Still, this was one heck of a way to show off the hardware's capabilities.
2, 1, go! Wow, what a start! This is just what I wanted to see! 3 laps to go!
Capcom wasn't happy with just porting the arcade version of Street Fighter the movie to the Saturn and PlayStation, so they made an entirely new game based on the same material. This plays pretty much like Super Turbo, wrapped up in the digitized characters of the film. And from a gameplay perspective, it's not bad at all. It has all the uppercuts, fireballs, throws, and super combo finishers you know and love. It just happens to also be one of the ugliest games of its day. The digitized fighters and backgrounds are washed out, animated poorly, and just look all kinds of rough. Somewhere between becoming a game based on a movie that was based on a game, it lost all its charm and personality. It's nowhere near as bad as it's often made out to be, but when you have a quality of pedigree like Capcom, this sticks out as a less than impressive showing. For what it's worth, it's just as good as the Saturn edition.
Round 2, fight!
First kick.
Hadouken! Hadouken! Shoryuken! Shizuru Hadouken! You win! Perfect!
If there was one launch title that sold the masses on Sony's new 32-bit machine, it was Takara's Battle Arena Toshindin. This 3D fighter was a stunner when it came to graphics. The textured mapped arenas and fighters stood out as vastly superior to anything that had been on a home console before. And in the gaming media leading up to launch, it was often pitted against Sega's Virtua Fighter as proof of just how much more powerful the PlayStation was. But underneath the candy-coated visuals lurked gameplay that was slow, shallow, and quite frankly, piss poor in every aspect. And no one in the gaming media told you the truth about that. They were all caught up in the hype of the visuals, and I mean all of them. Magazine after magazine bestowed countless praise on this steaming pile of wretched cat shit. It even won Best Game of the Year awards. It is an undeniable reminder that launch games are always judged by a different metric that hype plays a massive part in. Kalik, the DNA Imperative, was a first-person shooter that shared a number of similarities with the Saturn release of Robotica. Both have you wandering around sterile environments doing less than exciting things to move on to the next level. The combat is incredibly weak thanks to just wailing away on lifeless robots and nothing ever happening in the story to make you feel like you were really doing anything that matters. This was no Doom. On the plus side, it's another game that looked pretty nice on the PlayStation and showed the graphics potential. Enough of you must have bought it because it did get a sequel called Epidemic the following year. And if I'm honest, I didn't care much for that one either.
Cartridge secured. Repair parts secured.
Air Combat was one of the tamer looking games on the PlayStation, particularly since it came from Namco. But visuals aside, I love this game and it was easily my favorite launch title by a country mile. The world is in peril as an evil terrorist organization is attempting to overthrow the governments of the Allied nations. It's all based on made-up countries, but the gist is simple. Go in, blow up the bad guys, protect the good guys, and survive to see the end. This was the kind of stuff Sega should have been making for the Saturn as a maturation of their arcade games like Afterburner. Its mission-based go-anywhere-in-the-play area style of gameplay was crazy fun and easy to pick up. It was very loosely based on the idea behind the arcade game, but the content is pretty much all new. It sold extremely well worldwide and spawned numerous sequels that would go on to use the Japanese name Ace Combat for all future releases.
Enemy locked on target. Fire! Shoot down! Wasted! Enemy locked on target. Fire! Shoot down! Stay with him. Don't let him get away. Get away. Mission accomplished.
Our final launch game was one of those surprise out-of-the-blue releases that nabbed a whole lot of attention. ESPN Extreme Games was based on the X Games, a series of events that used skateboards, skates, bikes, and even the street luge. I was instantly drawn to this because it reminded me of a cross between Skitchin and Road Rash for the Sega Genesis, presented in a similar setup to how something like California Games worked. The visuals were awesome, the attitude was hip, and the gameplay was done just well enough to keep it fun and challenging. It was another game that Sony knew would appeal to teens and young adults, and they were absolutely right. So popular was it received multiple sequels that became one of the best-selling series for the platform in those early years. Though Sony's launch was filled with memorable titles that got a lot of attention, it was the rest of 1995 that quickly solidified them as the clear market leader in the West. Though Sega was doing well in Japan thanks to the popularity of its Virtua Fighter series, Sony was absolutely wiping the floor with its competition elsewhere. The following titles were all released in the calendar year of 1995 in the US, just a few short months after the launch. An absolutely killer list of software that Sega had no answer for. It was this lineup that sold the PlayStation as the console to own and the clear leader of the 32-bit generation. I didn't appreciate Jumping Flash back at its original release in November of 1995. The visuals looked simple and jumping around in a robot rabbit sounded dumb as hell. I came to regret that once I gave it a real chance because this was a really fun and well-made game. It's played from a first-person perspective and allows you to freely traverse its stages, and it's getting around those stages that makes this the gem it is. While it may seem like a shooter at first, it's much more a three-dimensional platformer where you find and collect things. The jumping mechanic is flawlessly handled and allows pinpoint movement that really elevates the gameplay. Don't let the cutesy setup fool you. This is a great game, start to finish. Destruction Derby hit in October of '95 and it was another visual showpiece for the PlayStation. And while all those cars bashing into one another and pieces flying everywhere was really impressive, you had to admire the physics engine on display as well. Your car would spin, deform, and control completely different as it was smashed to pieces. You could do traditional races, one big derby bowl, or a series of contests where the tracks had all kinds of crisscross sections that assured some nasty collisions. This was pure visceral bliss whether you liked the way it handled or not. Bashing into other cars at top speed was incredibly satisfying no matter who you were. Up until Doom on the PlayStation, the home ports had been a mixed bag. The Jaguar Doom had no music, the 32X Doom had way too much missing content. When it landed here in November of '95, it was the very best version of this game on console for years to come. Don't get me wrong, it's still missing stuff, and it's far from buttery smooth 100% of the time. But as far as everything else goes, it was a great experience. The music was incredible, the colored lighting looked cool, and the new skyline for some of the stages really stood out. It also featured compatibility with the System Link cable, so two players could battle monsters or each other on their very own screen. I still didn't have a PC in '95, so this was a big boon to the PlayStation library. A surprise hit for me was the whacked out run and gun Loaded, released in December of '95. It takes place in an asylum where you must break free, kill everything that moves, and get the hell out of Dodge. You won't find a game in those early days that was as fun or as simple to play as this. Shoot and survive, that's all you need to worry about. I love the exaggerated light sourcing effects from the weapons and explosions. Transparency effects are everywhere as well. All that eye candy does make it slow down quite a bit, but you're having so much fun you just won't care. It sold well and got a sequel that was unfortunately dead on arrival, killing the franchise completely. Sony scored a 32-bit exclusivity contract that guaranteed they were the only ones to receive Mortal Kombat 3 in October of 1995, and it was a huge reason why I wanted the console. The early screens I had seen looked arcade perfect, and when I finally got it, I was very impressed with the results. The PlayStation had a port of the arcade original a mere 6 months after its release, and it really was close to perfect. It still had the Shang Tsung loading issues that had dogged out the Sega CD edition of the first game, but outside of that, this was remarkably close. It wasn't going to change your mind if you didn't like Mortal Kombat 3 in the first place, but as a fan of the arcade, I was more than satisfied.
Fight. Look at y'all, look at. Look at y'all, look at. Sub-Zero wins.
Car combat games were nothing new when Twisted Metal was released in November of '95, but thanks to the 3D arenas, crazy cast of characters, and the dark atmosphere, you had never seen or played a car combat game like this before. Set in and around Los Angeles, you are dropped into a contest held by the mysterious Calypso, with the lone goal of eradicating your opponents. You'll be deploying machine guns, missiles, and landmines as you battle across warehouses, freeways, suburbia, and even the rooftops of massive skyscrapers. It was yet another game type that Sega had no answer for, and it sold big on the PlayStation, starting a series that got numerous entries. Like ESPN Extreme Games, Mortal Kombat 3, and many others, Sony was targeting these games at teens and young people in general, with themes that would grab attention and appeal to huge swaths of gamers. And as history has shown, it worked out very well. The importance of NFL Game Day's release in November of 1995 is often not focused on enough. To properly paint the picture, you need to understand that in 1995, Electronic Arts canceled its 32-bit Madden because of quality control issues. It just wasn't ready. That left a massive hole in NFL releases for the new 32-bit consoles. It was a hole that Sega, who had built a reputation as the sports company in the console world, failed to fill themselves on the Saturn. That left Sony's NFL Game Day as the only game in town for NFL fans wanting to show off their brand new platform. To say this was a boon to Sony's fortunes is a massive understatement. It drew sports fans to the PlayStation by the hundreds of thousands in the US alone. Being the only fully licensed 32-bit NFL game in town wasn't the only reason for its success. It also happened to be a well-made simulation of the sport that looked good and sounded even better. In one fell swoop, Sony ripped the moniker of sports leader right from Sega's hands. How in the hell Sega of America didn't have plans A, B, C, D, and F to get a full sports lineup on the Saturn in its first year has to be the biggest management failure in modern history. In November of 1995, Sony got a legitimately good 3D fighting game in Namco's Tekken. This one actually played well, and since the arcade version had been done on PlayStation technology, the port was pretty much spot on. It also had everything Virtua Fighter had needed to appeal to a Western audience. The fighters had style and personality. There were stories with endings, hidden characters and bosses, all the things a good fighting game needed to captivate its audience. It would be the fastest selling PlayStation game to 1 million units in those early days, and gave way to a series that is still going strong nearly 30 years later. Along with Mortal Kombat 3, it was Warhawk that really sold me on wanting a PlayStation in those early days. This November 95 release was yet another go-anywhere 3D shooter that absolutely shit on anything Sega had ready to compete with it. While Sega had commissioned the miserable Blackfire, Sony had made sure to get epic releases like this. You know the story here. Bad guy wants to take over and it's gonna take nothing less than blowing up tons of stuff to stop him. The gameplay is really nice, with both air and ground targets for you to destroy. It's got different endings, great special effects, and it runs surprisingly well considering everything that is happening on the screen. I easily transitioned from air combat into this, and Warhawk was my most played game for months. I wish Sony had stuck with it and released a few more of these in the years that followed. Our final big release of 1995 came in November, the futuristic combat racer Wipeout. This was billed as the best graphics your eyes had ever seen. And you know what? They were right. Wipeout was smooth with jaw-dropping visuals. Every stage looked better than the last, and the gameplay was essentially a roller coaster of barely controlled chaos. The combat allowed you to pick up missiles, shields, mines, and autopilots for those rough corners. Along with that attention-grabbing graphical presentation comes a soundtrack that pumped this to the next level of kick-ass gameplay. So good was this electronic bliss, it received its very own album at a time when you rarely saw such a thing for console music from a Western developer. Wipeout would go on to sell a huge amount of software for Sony, and despite a Saturn version the following year, the PlayStation always had the better looking and running version. Despite the craze for three-dimensional polygons at the time, the PlayStation had a surprising number of 2D releases in its first few months. Even many of its most popular 3D titles used two-dimensional sprites for many of its assets. I think this showed that gamers were not opposed to software that used a mixture of old and new technologies, furthering questions of why Sega had so much trouble getting a proper game lineup ready for its Western Saturn lineup. If 3D development presented too many hurdles, why was Sonic not 2.5D at launch? Why were the sports games on the Genesis not upgraded with new polygon assets to give the visuals a boost? The failure of Sega in this light wasn't just about a conflict between Japanese and American staff. It was about a complete failure to read the room, make good decisions, and build a library of software that appealed to your fan base and beyond. Sony outclassed Sega at every turn in those early months, building its own reputation as a top-tier games maker in the process. It could be argued that Sega had a number of titles that played better at launch. I'd agree with you if you said Virtua Fighter was a far superior experience to Toshindin in terms of gameplay. Daytona USA was a dream to control next to Ridge Racer as well. But there needs to be a balance that cannot be ignored. Daytona and Virtua Fighter alone were bare-bones ports that were not gonna sell the Saturn. No different than Toshindin and Ridge Racer alone would not have given Sony the lead it eventually had. While the dedicated Sega fandom can look back and fondly remember releases like Clockwork Knight, Astal, and Panzer Dragoon, these games did not have the same level of far-reaching marketing appeal. Sony didn't just have games that perked up the ears of those that loved the hobby, they also had games that PlayStation owners could get their more casual friends excited about just by describing them. That type of word-of-mouth advertising builds a powerful hype machine that moves units and puts asses in the seats. Sony covered all their bases with a near flawless strategy that left Sega looking like fools to a market they once dominated easily. The success of the PlayStation wasn't just about what Sega and Nintendo did wrong, but also about everything Sony did right. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.